A forgotten clan of Appalachia has been living without sunlight for 50 years, buried alive by a community's darkest secret. When folklorist Eleanor Grant arrives by horseback in the mountain settlement of Black Hollow in the autumn of 1892, she thinks she's collecting traditional ballads and superstitions, but whispered warnings from terrified locals tell a different story. Some souls should stay buried, they say, ain't seen God's light, not once in 50 years. Hidden behind a stone wall built into the ridge, sealed by authorities during the harsh winter of 1842, lies the truth that will shatter everything Eleanor believes about Christian charity. These aren't demons lurking in the darkness, they're survivors. A family condemned as devil-touched and entombed during a mining collapse, forgotten by the world above, raising children who have never felt sunlight on their skin, generations born in perpetual darkness, sustained by cave fish and mushrooms, kept alive by hymns and desperate faith. When Eleanor finally breaks through the mortared stones with a pickaxe, she discovers pale figures cowering from her oil lamp, mistaking its flame for the sun they've only heard about in scripture. She meets Mara, a child with haunting bright eyes who draws suns in the dirt but has never seen one. The clan's elders whisper of heaven's fire, while their matriarch keeps spoken records of every birth, every death, every soul erased from the church records. But Eleanor's discovery sets off a chain reaction that threatens to destroy the very people she's trying to save. As circuit preachers arrive, declaring them possessed, and townspeople demand their removal, the clan faces their greatest peril yet: exposure to a world that sees them as proof of God's wrath, rather than victims of man's cruelty. How do you save people who have been buried alive by Christian fear itself? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Eleanor Grant's horse picked its way carefully along the mountain trail as autumn twilight settled over the Appalachian settlement of Black Hollow. The year was 1892, and she had traveled by train from Boston and then by horseback for 3 days to reach this remote community, drawn by reports of unique folk traditions and ancient ballads preserved in the mountains. Her leather satchel contained notebooks for recording songs, interviews, and customs that scholars believed were vanishing from the American frontier. Eleanor had made her reputation studying the oral traditions of isolated communities, one of the few women in her field brave enough to venture into the wilderness alone. The settlement's general store was lit by oil lamps when she arrived, and conversations died as she entered. Mountain folk were naturally suspicious of outsiders, but this felt different. This felt like fear. "I'm collecting traditional songs and stories," Eleanor explained to the gathered men. "I'm particularly interested in old ballads about families who lived in these mountains." An elderly man with a weathered face glanced toward the others before speaking. "We don't truck with such talk, miss. Some stories are better left buried." Eleanor persisted. "I've heard whispers of a family called the Harrows. Old songs mention—" "Ain't no Harrows," another man interrupted sharply. "Never was. You best move on come morning." As Eleanor prepared to leave for the small boarding house, the weathered man approached her quietly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Some souls should stay buried, lady. Some souls are buried for keeping the devil's company." That night, by candlelight in her small room, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "There is a story here that goes beyond folklore. These people guard a secret that terrifies them." The next morning, Eleanor visited the county clerk's office, housed in a small log building that served multiple government functions. The records were kept in wooden boxes, and many documents showed water damage and age. The clerk, a nervous man named Silas, watched her every movement with obvious discomfort. "I'm researching genealogical records from the 1840s, Eleanor explained. "Particularly the Harrow family." Silas hesitated, then led her to a collection of ledgers that looked as if they hadn't been disturbed in decades. As Eleanor worked through marriage records, birth certificates, and property deeds, she found scattered references to the Harrow family through the 1830s. Then, nothing. In a water-stained newspaper from 1842, she discovered a brief article, "Mining Accident Claims Local Family." The report was sparse, mentioning a cave-in at an old mine shaft that had claimed the lives of the Harrow clan, whose bodies could not be recovered due to unstable conditions. But as Eleanor examined the records more carefully, she noticed something troubling. The Harrow family's property deeds showed no transfer of ownership after 1842. Their personal effects were never inventoried. No burial records existed despite the newspaper's claim of their deaths. As she prepared to leave, she overheard two elderly women whispering near the courthouse steps. "Still hear the singing when the winds ride, pale figures walking the ridge at night." Sheriff Whitmore said we was to never speak of what happened. That evening, Eleanor found the original newspaper article and studied it by lamplight. Below the main story was a smaller notice about a mine collapse that had sealed dangerous passages for the safety of the community. The date matched the Harrow family's disappearance. On her third day in Black Hollow, Eleanor visited Amos Carter's general store. The building was older than the others, its hand-hewn logs darkened with age. Inside, shelves lined with dry goods created narrow aisles, and everything smelled of wood smoke and preserved meat. Amos Carter sat behind a worn wooden counter, his hands folded over a ledger book. Unlike the others, he didn't look away when she approached, though his eyes held the weight of many years. "You're the one asking about the Harrows," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. "I believe they didn't die in 1842. I think something else happened to them." Amos was quiet for a long time, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of his ledger. Finally he spoke. "I was 19 when it happened. Winter of 1842 was the harshest anyone could remember. Folks were scared, hungry, looking for someone to blame for their troubles." He described how the Harrow family had been accused of consorting with dark forces, of bringing bad luck to the community through their isolation and strange ways. When a mining accident provided the opportunity, Sheriff Whitmore and the town council made a decision that haunted Amos to this day. "They said it was God's will," Amos continued, his voice shaking. "Said the Harrows were cursed, and sealing them away would protect the righteous. I helped carry the stones, helped mix the mortar. I was young and afraid, and I believed what the preacher told us." He described hearing voices singing hymns from deep within the ridge, echoing through the rock like souls crying out for salvation. "You can still hear them sometimes," Amos whispered, "when the wind is right and the night is still. Voices calling out to the Lord from the bottom of a well." Eleanor left the store with directions to the ridge, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had learned. Eleanor hiked into the forest, following an old hunter's trail, carrying an oil lantern and a pickaxe she had borrowed from the boarding house. The autumn woods were thick with undergrowth, and every step took her deeper into a wilderness that seemed untouched by civilization. After an hour of climbing, she found what Amos had described, a wall of carefully mortared stones built directly into the rock face. The craftsmanship was solid, designed to last. Carved into one of the stones, barely visible beneath 50 years of weathering, were the words, "By God's judgment." Eleanor examined the wall carefully. This wasn't the result of a mining accident. This was deliberate construction. Near the base, she found a fragment of paper wedged between two stones. The ink was faded, but she could make out portions of what appeared to be a sheriff's statement. Decision reached after much prayer, for the protection of Christian souls, sealed by divine providence. May the Lord forgive. As Eleanor began working with the pickaxe, chipping away at the old mortar, she felt the weight of what she was about to uncover. Each strike of the tool echoed through the forest, and she found herself praying that she would find only bones and silence behind the wall. But as she worked, she began to hear something that made her blood run cold. Singing. Faint but unmistakable, rising from somewhere beyond the stones. Human voices, weak but persistent, singing an old hymn she recognized from her childhood. The sun was setting as Eleanor finally broke through the wall. Beyond lay a tunnel carved from living rock, disappearing into absolute darkness. The air that flowed out was stale and damp, carrying the scent of decades of human habitation. Eleanor lit her lantern and stepped inside, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The tunnel extended deeper into the mountain than Eleanor had expected, opening into a series of natural caverns that had been transformed into living spaces. Her lantern light revealed crude furniture carved from stone, sleeping areas marked by worn blankets, and walls covered with primitive drawings of suns, trees, and birds. The air was thick with the smell of humanity, not unpleasant, but unmistakably lived in. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, she could hear movement, whispered voices, the sound of people trying to hide from her intrusion. Eleanor called out softly, "Hello? I'm here to help. My name is Eleanor Grant." The sound stopped. Then slowly figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men, women, and children whose skin was so pale it seemed to glow in the lamplight. Their eyes were large and dark, adapted to perpetual darkness, and they cowered away from her lantern as if it were fire itself. An elderly woman approached cautiously, her movements careful and dignified despite her obvious frailty. Are you an angel?" she whispered, her voice cracked from disuse. "No," Eleanor replied gently. "I'm just a woman." "Are you Ruth Harrow?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I am Ruth Harrow. We thought the Lord had forgotten us." A small girl peered out from behind Ruth's tattered dress. Her eyes were bright with intelligence despite their oversized appearance. Eleanor knelt down to her level. "What's your name, child?" "Mara," the girl whispered. She pointed at Eleanor's lantern. "Is that heaven's fire?" Eleanor's heart broke. "No, sweetheart, this is just a lamp. But there's a much bigger fire in the sky called the sun, and it lights up the whole world." An elderly man emerged from the shadows, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "The sun. We thought it had died when the world ended." Eleanor spent the night in the underground complex, listening to a story that grew more heartbreaking with each detail. Ruth Harrow, despite her frailty, spoke with the dignity of someone who had borne 50 years of unimaginable hardship. "Our family had lived in these mountains since before the revolution," Ruth began, her voice carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to telling stories. "We kept to ourselves, practiced the old ways, grew herbs that some folks called witchcraft, but we knew as healing. The story that emerged was one of religious hysteria and scapegoating. During the harsh winter of 1842, when crops failed and children died of fever, the community needed someone to blame. The Harrows, with their isolation and knowledge of folk medicine, became convenient targets for accusations of devil worship. Reverend McKinnon preached that we had brought God's wrath upon the valley," Ruth continued. "Said our bloodline was cursed, that we consorted with dark spirits. When the mine shaft collapsed and trapped us inside, Sheriff Whitmore declared it divine judgment." Eleanor wrote furiously by lamplight, documenting every detail. The clan had survived on fish from an underground stream, mushrooms they learned to cultivate in the darkness, and occasionally small animals that wandered into their domain. "We kept the faith," Ruth said proudly. "Every Sunday we held service. We sang the hymns our mothers taught us. We told the children about sunshine and green grass and growing things, even though we began to wonder if such things still existed." Thomas Harrow, Ruth's husband, spoke up from his place by the wall. "We raised 5 generations on hope alone. Hope that someday someone would remember us. Hope that God would send deliverance." Eleanor looked around the cavern at faces that had never seen daylight and realized she was witnessing one of the most remarkable examples of faith and endurance in human history. Eleanor spent the following days learning about Mara's extraordinary world. The child was perhaps 11 years old, though malnutrition made it difficult to determine. What amazed Eleanor was Mara's intelligence and curiosity, which had flourished despite a lifetime in darkness. Mara proudly showed Eleanor through the clan's living spaces, pointing out innovations born of necessity. "This is where we catch the fish," she explained, indicating a small pool fed by the underground stream. "And here is where grandmother keeps the word." Ruth had created an oral library of incredible scope, memorizing not only Bible verses but also family histories, folk tales, and practical knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Mara could recite dozens of psalms from memory, knew the genealogy of every family member going back to their arrival in America, and had learned to read using a water-damaged Bible that had somehow survived the imprisonment. When Eleanor showed Mara a small painting of a landscape from her traveling case, the girl's reaction was extraordinary. She gasped, her pale hands reaching toward the image of blue sky and green trees, as if she could touch them. "Is this the kingdom of heaven?" Mara asked, her voice filled with wonder. "No, sweetheart," Eleanor explained. "This is the world outside, the world you were born to see." Mara stared at the painting for hours, tracing the clouds with one finger. The stories grandmother tells. "They're all true?" "Every one of them," Eleanor confirmed. That night, as Eleanor slept on a bed of woven grass, Mara curled up beside her, clutching the painting like a sacred relic. For the first time in 50 years, someone from the outside world had confirmed that their faith had not been in vain, that the world of sunshine and growing things still existed beyond their stone prison. Eleanor fell asleep to the sound of Mara whispering the names of colors she had never seen: blue, green, yellow. Eleanor's return to Black Hollow was met with immediate hostility. Word of her activities had spread through the small community, and the comfortable fiction they had maintained for 50 years was under threat. When she requested a meeting with the town's leadership, she found herself facing Reverend Ezekiel Harlan, the current preacher who had inherited his predecessor's certainty about divine judgment. "Miss Grant," Reverend Harlan said, his voice resonating with biblical authority, "I understand you've been disturbing things that were sealed by God's own hand." "I've been investigating a crime," Eleanor replied steadily. "There are people living in those caves, Reverend. People who have been imprisoned for 50 years. The Reverend's face darkened. "The Harrow clan was judged by the Almighty. Their fate was sealed by divine providence, not human hands." Eleanor pulled out her documentation, copies of records, witness statements, and her own observations. These people were condemned by fear and superstition, not divine judgment. They've maintained their faith through 5 decades of suffering that would have broken most souls. "Faith?" Reverend Harlan laughed bitterly. "The devil can quote scripture, Miss Grant. Those creatures you found are proof of God's wrath against the unrighteous." Eleanor realized she was facing a man who would rather maintain a comfortable lie than confront an uncomfortable truth. The preservation of the community's sense of divine favor was more important to him than the lives of the people his predecessor had condemned. "This isn't over," Eleanor said as she prepared to leave. The Reverend's final words followed her to the door. "Be careful, Miss Grant. The Lord punishes those who interfere with his judgment." As Eleanor walked to her horse, she could feel eyes watching her from every window. The righteous certainty that had protected Black Hollow for 50 years was being challenged, and everyone could sense it. Then, Eleanor returned to the ridge with supplies: books, bread, preserved meat, and woolen blankets. The clan received her gifts with the wonder of people who had forgotten that the outside world contained kindness, but it was the books that truly transformed the underground community. Mara proved to be an eager student, quickly learning to read beyond the biblical passages she had memorized. Eleanor brought primers and simple texts, watching as Mara's world expanded with each page. "What's this creature?" Mara asked, pointing to an illustration of a horse. "That's a horse," Eleanor explained. "They're strong and gentle, and people ride them to travel long distances." "Do they still exist?" Mara whispered, as if afraid the answer might be no. "Very much so. Someday you'll meet one." In return for her gifts, Ruth began to share the clan's most precious possession, their complete oral history. She recited the names of every child born in the caves, every elder who had died hoping to see sunlight again, every soul that had lived and died unrecorded by the outside world. Eleanor wrote each name in her journal, understanding that she was becoming the keeper of their legacy. These weren't just names. They were proof that the Harrow clan had maintained their humanity in the face of impossible circumstances. Sarah Harrow, born 1844, died 1848 of lung fever, Ruth recited. Baby Thomas, born 1851, lived only 3 days. Mary Harrow, born 1855, lived to bear 6 children in darkness. The recitation continued for hours, each name a testament to lives lived in hope despite hopeless circumstances. As Eleanor prepared to leave that evening, the clan gathered in their largest cavern and sang a hymn of thanksgiving. Their voices echoed through the stone chambers, a sound of pure gratitude from people who had learned to find joy in the smallest acts of human kindness. Eleanor had prepared carefully for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for Mara's reaction to her first experience with natural light. They emerged from the tunnel at dawn when the light was gentlest, but even the pale morning sun was overwhelming for eyes that had never seen its light. Mara stumbled as sunlight touched her skin for the first time, her pale complexion immediately beginning to redden. Her eyes, perfectly adapted for absolute darkness, squeezed shut against what seemed like divine fire. But despite the pain and fear, she whispered words that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "It's beautiful." Eleanor held the girl as she collapsed, her body unable to handle the sensory overload of the natural world. Everything was too bright, too warm, too real. Mara's skin burned despite the weak autumn sun, and tears streamed from her light-sensitive eyes. But she was smiling through the pain. "Heaven's fire," Mara gasped. "It's real. Grandmother's stories, they were all true." Eleanor had to carry Mara back into the protective darkness of the tunnel, understanding the cruel irony of the situation. The very world Mara longed to experience was the one thing that might destroy her. That night, as Mara lay recovering in the cool darkness, she spoke dreamily about what she had witnessed. The light. It fills up everything, and the sky goes on forever, and there are so many colors. Eleanor sat beside her, understanding that she had opened a door that could never be closed. Mara had glimpsed the world beyond the mountain, and she would never be content with darkness again. But Eleanor also understood the terrible choice she had created: remain safe in the familiar darkness, or risk everything for a chance at the light. The secret couldn't remain hidden once Eleanor began her work. Within a week, curious visitors began arriving in Black Hollow, traveling preachers, newspaper correspondents, and government officials drawn by reports of the miraculous discovery. The mountain settlement, which had successfully hidden its secret for 50 years, suddenly found itself at the center of unwanted attention. The newspaper accounts were sensational. Cave dwellers discovered in Kentucky mountains, the lost tribe of Apache, living proof of divine judgment. Eleanor watched in horror as the story was twisted to serve various agendas. Religious newspapers portrayed the clan as either proof of God's wrath or evidence of divine preservation, depending on their theological leanings. Secular papers treated them as curiosities, products of mountain inbreeding and superstition. The clan, already fragile from their underground existence, were terrified by the constant activity near their home. The sounds of horses, wagons, and crowds of visitors drove them deeper into the caves, away from the entrance Eleanor had opened. "Make them go away," Mara pleaded during one of Eleanor's visits. "Their voices, they're too loud. They hurt." Eleanor tried to control the narrative, giving careful interviews where she emphasized the clan's humanity and the injustice they had suffered. But her measured words were overwhelmed by sensational headlines and inflammatory editorials that portrayed the Harrows as everything from angels to demons. The worst moment came when a photographer from a traveling show somehow gained access to the tunnel and took pictures of the clan without their consent. The images, pale figures cowering from camera flashes, appeared in newspapers across the region, turning the Harrows into objects of public fascination. Eleanor felt sick as she read the captions: "The Devil's Children of Kentucky" and "Freaks of Nature Found Alive." Media attention forced local and state authorities to act, but their solution proved more devastating than the original imprisonment. A combination of county officials, medical authorities, and religious leaders descended on Black Hollow, with plans to relocate the clan to appropriate Christian institutions, where they could receive proper care and moral instruction. Eleanor watched helplessly as the Harrows were removed from the only home they had ever known and transported by wagon to various facilities, almhouses, church-run hospitals, and charitable institutions. The clan, who had survived 50 years together, were separated and scattered across 3 counties. Their bodies, perfectly adapted to their underground existence, began to fail almost immediately. The elders, already frail, couldn't adjust to the change in environment and the constant presence of strangers. Their immune systems, isolated for decades, had no defense against common illnesses. The unfamiliar food made them sick. The constant light caused headaches and disorientation. Eleanor traveled from institution to institution, visiting the scattered clan members and watching them grow weaker despite the improved conditions. Ruth Harrow, who had been the strong matriarch of her people, lay in a charity hospital bed, barely able to speak. "We were free in the darkness," Ruth whispered to Eleanor during one visit. "Free to be ourselves, to sing our songs, to remember our dead. Here we are specimens in God's menagerie." Mara, placed in a church-run orphanage, had developed a persistent cough. Her body, which had never been exposed to the diseases that children normally encountered, couldn't fight off simple infection. Eleanor began to understand the cruel irony of her rescue mission. The clan had survived as a family in the darkness, but exposure to the civilized world was destroying them in ways that 50 years of imprisonment had not. The first death came on a gray October morning. Thomas Harrow, the clan's patriarch, passed away in the county almshouse, his body finally surrendering to a world it was never meant to inhabit. Eleanor received word by telegram and rushed to the facility, where she found Ruth sitting beside her husband's bed. "He died in the light," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "He never wanted that. He wanted to return to the caves, to die where his children were born." More deaths followed in quick succession. The clan's immune systems, protected for decades in their isolated environment, couldn't adapt to the diseases of the outside world. Each funeral was smaller than the last, as the family that had survived 50 years underground was systematically destroyed by exposure to civilization. Eleanor blamed herself for every death. She had broken down the wall thinking she was offering salvation, but instead she had delivered them to a different kind of death sentence. The clan had been prisoners in the cave, but they had been alive and together. Now they were free, separated, and dying. During one particularly difficult night, as Eleanor sat vigil beside Mara's bed at the orphanage, Ruth arrived unexpectedly. The old woman had somehow convinced her caretakers to let her visit the child. "You did what you believed was right," Ruth said softly to Eleanor. "You couldn't have known the cost. I should have left you alone," Eleanor replied, her voice breaking with guilt. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, then spoke words that would haunt Eleanor forever. "We were already dying in the darkness, just more slowly. At least now our deaths will serve a purpose." That night, Ruth Harrow died as quietly as she had lived. Her last words to Eleanor a whispered plea. "Write our story true. Do not let them make us into monsters or saints. We were just people who loved each other." The funeral was held on a cold November morning on the ridge where Eleanor had first broken through the mortared wall. Of the 12 clan members she had discovered, only 3 remained alive. Mara, now weakened but determined to honor her family, and 2 distant cousins who had somehow adapted better to the outside world. Eleanor had fought church and county authorities to hold the service in the mountains rather than in a formal cemetery. She understood that the clan needed to come home, even if only for this final goodbye. The graves were simple, mounds of earth marked by rough wooden crosses that the survivors had carved themselves. But the hymn that rose from the small gathering was anything but simple. The same haunting melody Eleanor had first heard echoing from the sealed cave now floated freely across the mountainside. Mara's voice was thin but clear as she sang the words her grandmother had taught her. Eleanor found herself joining in, though she knew only some of the verses. The song seemed to connect the living with the dead, the imprisoned with the free, the forgotten with the remembered. As the last notes faded across the valley, Eleanor looked at the simple graves and made a solemn promise. These people had been buried alive once by fear and ignorance. She would not let them be buried again by history's indifference. Mara clutched Eleanor's hand as they stood beside the fresh graves. "They're with the Lord now," the girl whispered. "No more walls, no more darkness." Eleanor nodded, understanding that salvation came in many forms. For the clan, death had become the ultimate liberation from a world that had never truly accepted them. But for the living, redemption meant something different. It meant carrying their story forward, ensuring that their voices would never be silenced again. The mountain wind carried the sound of their hymn down into the valley below, where it would echo in memory long after the voices were gone. Eleanor returned to her boarding house that night with a sense of mission that cut through her grief. She had trunks full of notes, personal testimonies, and documentation that needed to be preserved. The clan's story demanded to be told, but it needed to be told truthfully and with dignity. She spent the next month writing, crafting a detailed account that would reveal not just the existence of the Harrow clan, but the systematic injustice that had been perpetrated against them. Her manuscript exposed the religious hysteria of 1842, the conspiracy of silence that followed, and the tragic consequences of bringing the clan into a world unprepared for their existence. The story she wrote wasn't about monsters or divine judgment. It was about people who had maintained their faith in humanity under impossible circumstances, who had raised children on hope alone, who had sung hymns in the darkness, and never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. Eleanor documented every member of the clan, recounting their births, their lives, and their deaths with the respect they had been denied in life. She exposed the officials who had made the decision to wall them up and the subsequent generations who had maintained the conspiracy of silence. Her manuscript began with a dedication for Ruth, Thomas, and all the forgotten souls whose names were stolen by fear, in memory of those who kept faith in the darkness. On a cold December morning, Eleanor packaged her completed manuscript and sent it by train to publishers in New York and Boston. Along with the written account, she included transcriptions of the clan's hymns and copies of every document she had uncovered. The package felt heavy in her hands as she gave it to the railway clerk, but Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months. She had honored her promise to Ruth Harrow. The clan would not be forgotten. When Eleanor's account was published the following spring, it created a sensation that reached far beyond the mountains of Kentucky. The Buried Clan of Black Hollow, a true account of religious persecution and survival, became one of the most talked about books of 1893, sparking debates in churches, universities, and government halls across the nation. The response was sharply divided. Progressive religious leaders praised Eleanor's work as an indictment of extremism and a call for Christian compassion. Conservative ministers denounced her account as blasphemous, claiming she had fabricated the story to attack faithful communities. Scholars debated the anthropological implications of a group isolated for 50 years. Eleanor found herself traveling to speak at universities and church conferences, sharing the clan's story with audiences who struggled to comprehend both the cruelty of their imprisonment and the miracle of their survival. Each presentation was emotionally exhausting, but she persevered because she understood this was part of her responsibility to Ruth and her family. The most meaningful responses came in letters from common people, farmers, laborers, and frontier families who recognized in the Harrow clan's story echoes of their own struggles with prejudice and persecution. One letter from a minister in Ohio particularly moved her. "Your account has challenged me to examine my own heart for the seeds of the fear that destroyed the Harrow family. May God grant that we learn from their suffering and never again mistake our prejudices for divine will." But Eleanor's greatest satisfaction came not from public recognition, but from the knowledge that she had kept her promise. The clan's names were now part of the historical record. Their story would be studied, discussed, and remembered by future generations who would learn from both their suffering and their extraordinary endurance. As winter settled over the mountains again, Eleanor understood that her work was far from over. Eleanor's most important responsibility remained with Mara, the last child of the Harrow clan. The girl's health was still fragile, but her spirit had proven remarkably resilient. When the orphanage proved unable to provide the specialized care Mara needed, Eleanor petitioned the court to become her legal guardian. The guardianship process was complicated in an era when unmarried women rarely took on such responsibilities. But Eleanor's growing reputation as a scholar and her obvious dedication to Mara's welfare eventually convinced the authorities. Slowly and carefully, Eleanor helped Mara adjust to life in the outside world. They moved to a small house on the outskirts of a larger town where Mara could gradually acclimate to the sounds and rhythms of civilization. Eleanor bought her tinted glasses to protect her sensitive eyes and light-colored clothing that wouldn't absorb too much heat. Mara's intelligence flourished in the safety of Eleanor's care. She devoured books with the hunger of someone making up for a lifetime of limited access to knowledge. She learned about geography, natural history, literature, and mathematics, with the wonder of someone discovering that the stories her grandmother told were all rooted in reality. "Is it true that there are great cities with thousands of people?" Mara asked one day while reading about New York. "It's true," Eleanor confirmed. "Someday, when you're stronger, we might visit one." Mara's eyes shone with possibility. Despite everything she had lost, despite the trauma she carried, she maintained an extraordinary capacity for hope and wonder. Eleanor enrolled her in a small private school run by a sympathetic teacher who understood Mara's unique circumstances. The other children were initially curious about her pale appearance and strange background, but Mara's gentle nature and quick intelligence soon won their acceptance. The moment Eleanor had been preparing for came on a clear autumn evening nearly 2 years after Mara had been brought into the light. They sat together on the porch of their small house, wrapped in warm quilts against the mountain chill. "Are you ready to see something wonderful?" Eleanor asked. Mara nodded, her pale eyes bright with curiosity. Since emerging from the cave, she had seen sunlight, trees, animals, and countless other wonders. But tonight would be special. Eleanor pointed upward, and Mara followed her gaze to the night sky. Above them, thousands of stars glittered against the darkness like jewels scattered on black silk. For the first time in her life, Mara was seeing the universe in all its infinite beauty. The girl's reaction exceeded all of Eleanor's expectations. Mara gasped, her hands reaching toward the sky as if she could gather the starlight in her fingers. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process the overwhelming beauty above her. "They're real," Mara whispered in amazement. "All of them are real." Eleanor embraced her gently, understanding that this moment represented more than just Mara's first glimpse of the stars. It represented the triumph of hope over despair, light over darkness, freedom over captivity. "This is your true inheritance," Eleanor said softly. "The stars belong to you as much as anyone." Mara was quiet for a long time, memorizing the patterns above her. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with wonder and recognition. "Grandmother told me that the stars were holes in heaven's floor, where the light of paradise shines through. She said they were watching over all God's children, even the ones forgotten by man." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks as she realized that Ruth Harrow's faith had prepared Mara for this moment, even from the depths of the cave. Eleanor's final lecture took place at Harvard University in the spring of 1895, marking the culmination of her work documenting the Harrow clan story. The auditorium was filled with professors, students, and distinguished visitors who had come to hear the definitive account of one of the most remarkable survival stories in American history. She began her presentation simply. "Today, I want to tell you about extraordinary people who maintained their humanity in circumstances that would have broken most souls. People who raised children on faith alone and never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption." Eleanor's lecture was both scholarly and deeply personal. She presented her research methodically. The historical evidence, the documented conspiracy, the systematic cruelty that had trapped innocent people in darkness for half a century. But the heart of her presentation was the reading of names, giving each clan member a moment of recognition that had been denied them in life. "Ruth Harrow," she read aloud, "who kept the oral history of her people for 50 years. Thomas Harrow, who carved toys for children who had never seen the light. Sarah Harrow, who lived only 4 years but was loved completely." The audience sat in respectful silence as Eleanor recited name after name, ensuring that each person was acknowledged and remembered. By the time she finished, Many in the auditorium were openly weeping. These people were not victims of divine judgment, Eleanor concluded. They were casualties of human fear and prejudice. Their story challenges us to examine our own hearts and ask what injustices we might be perpetuating in the name of righteousness. The standing ovation lasted nearly 15 minutes, but more important than the applause were the conversations that followed. Discussions about religious tolerance, social responsibility, and the ongoing need to protect society's most vulnerable members. Years later, Eleanor and Mara made their annual pilgrimage to the ridge where the clan had been buried. The original wall had been torn down completely, and a proper memorial now marked the site. Fresh wildflowers lay at the base of the stone marker, evidence that others had begun to remember and honor the forgotten dead. Mara, now 18 and preparing to attend teacher's college, had grown into a thoughtful young woman with her grandmother's dignity and wisdom. She had never fully adapted to bright sunlight, still preferring the gentle hours of dawn and dusk, but she had found her place in a world that had initially seemed too harsh for her existence. Together they sang the hymn that Eleanor had first heard echoing from the sealed cave so many years before. Mara's voice was strong now, carrying the melody with confidence and hope rather than the desperate longing of her underground years. "Do you think they know?" Mara asked as the last notes faded across the valley. "Do you think they understand that people remember them now?" "I believe they've always known," Eleanor replied. "They know every time someone tells their story, every time someone speaks their names, every time someone refuses to let fear triumph over compassion." Mara nodded, understanding that memory itself was a form of resurrection. She placed a small bouquet of mountain laurel on the memorial, whispering a prayer that Eleanor couldn't quite hear but recognized as both thanksgiving and benediction. As they prepared to leave, Mara looked back at the memorial one final time. "They're not buried anymore," she said with quiet certainty. "Their story lives in the light now." Eleanor squeezed her hand, understanding that Mara had found her own way of honoring the past while embracing the future. The clan's legacy would live on through her and through all the people who would hear their story in years to come. Eleanor and Mara sat on their front porch as the sun set over the valley, painting the evening sky in shades of gold and rose that Mara still found miraculous after all these years. It had been 7 years since Eleanor had first broken through the mortared wall, and their lives had settled into a rhythm of quiet purpose and contentment. Mara, now 19 and teaching at the local school, had developed into an accomplished educator with a gift for reaching children who struggled with learning. Her own experience of discovering the world late in life gave her unusual patience with students who needed extra time and care. In the evenings, Mara often sketched in a leather-bound journal Eleanor had given her. The pages were filled with detailed drawings of the world she had discovered. Flowers, birds, landscapes, and faces of the people who had shown her kindness. Her art had evolved from the crude sun drawings of her cave years into sophisticated studies that captured both beauty and emotion. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found us?" Mara asked as she worked on a drawing of the memorial stone. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes, but I believe God meant for your story to be told. Your family's faith deserved to be witnessed and honored." Mara smiled, her pale eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Grandmother always said that nothing happens by accident. She believed that even our suffering served a purpose, that somehow our story would help others." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mara closed her journal and tilted her face toward the heavens. The simple gesture had become a nightly ritual, her way of connecting with the family she had lost and the infinite possibilities that still lay ahead. "I found my light," Mara whispered, echoing words she had spoken years earlier as a frightened child emerging from darkness. The story ended with the sound of evening settling peacefully over the mountains, carrying with it the promise that some truths, once revealed, would shine forever.